I've started with this project, effectively about 2 years ago, but we've been developing this idea for a long time actually. We've been studying the architecture of bone tissue on the nanoscale for a while, and then slowly we started developing the different aspects that actually have to be put together to make up the bone tissue in all of its complexity. So we spent quite a bit of time developing three-dimensional vasculature in the lab. So we engineer vascularized tissues. One of the first discoveries that the lab had was how to 3D print blood vessels. We were one of the first ones to do that. So we basically figured out how to engineer the vasculature. Then we figured out how to engineer innervation in the lab. And then for this project, what we did was to bring it all together, the vasculature, the innervation, the complexity of the bone tissue on the nanoscale, and essentially we're able to package it all into a single piece of tissue that we're able to engineer in the lab. So now we can engineer these bone-like tissues that have all of the nanoscale complexity of bone. It has a vasculature, it has an innervation, and it also matches a lot of the complexity of the bone biology. For instance, we're able to mimic how different types of cancers metastasize into bone and so on. So basically, it started by bringing these pieces together and essentially making it all work in synergy, which is really the complex part of the project. We can actually engineer these building blocks together relatively quickly in essentially what makes it look like bone is actually the calcium phosphate, the mineral part, right? And that we can trigger on demand, and we can actually make it happen in about 3 days or less. We actually are able to do that overnight now. Typically, people have done this in the lab, and before our publication came out, this would take up to 28 days, and now we were able to do it overnight. So it's really a big difference in performance for what we're actually able to achieve. And not only that, but also, in a way, we're able to make it a lot better because it mimics the specific nanoscale structure of bone tissue, and that's essentially what makes bone, a rigid material, what makes bone kind of like a complex biological system. There's actually a lot of uses, and we're pushing these in many different directions. So it's essentially a platform technology. So what we can use it for is essentially to help grow or regenerate bone, either in the lab or in the clinic, much more easily. So right now, for instance, what you have to do is you have to extract a piece of bone from the patient, and then the patient has to be hospitalized because essentially, he or she just lost a piece of bone, and then you kind of like break down that bone and reimplant back into the other side of injury into that patient. So what we're able to do now, and that's one of the directions we're pushing for, is to engineer this bone in the lab without actually having to take bone from the patient and essentially re-inject back into the patient and regenerate bones much better, much more quickly. That's one of the applications. The other application which we're also developing is to use this as a drug screening platform or a drug discovery platform, or as a model system to understand disease. So for instance, because we don't have to take a piece of bone from a patient to study how drugs work or how diseases will interact with bone, we can actually do that in the lab much more easily, and then we can break down the mechanisms. We can essentially add or remove different parts of the bone, like we can put the vasculature or not, we can put the innervation or not, and understand exactly what each component is doing to initiate cancers or to lead to some results for some drugs here and there. So essentially, it opens up a broad range of real-life opportunities for medicine, and it can truly be transformative, we believe, and that's essentially what we're pushing to prove now. So this is just the first step, and hopefully there will be plenty more to come in the following years. We're particularly interested in a couple of cancers, especially prostate cancer that metastasizes into bone quite frequently, and also bone marrow cancers, leukemia. So we're using these to understand how these cancers essentially initiate and grow, and how to develop better model systems to understand, or how to develop better drugs for these types of cancers. And we're also interested in the regeneration, which is mostly what we do in our lab. So we're really pushing now to speed up the process of creating the bone. I mean, it's already very fast compared to anything that is out there, but we want to be able to do that in the clinic, in the operating room, in a way that the clinician could actually harvest stem cells from the patient, use our process to create kind of like mini pieces of bone, and then essentially implant that back into the patient in a single surgery. So those are the immediate steps that we're taking, both the regenerative medicine approach and also understanding how cancers progress and initiate, and how to develop better drugs for those. I think that the technology itself is not too far from being used in terms of what we will need to understand before we can actually use it in the patients. The real question is the regulatory hurdles that we have to clear in order to be able to use that in humans. The FDA at the moment doesn't necessarily allow for stem cell delivery based treatments such as the ones that we developed in the lab. There's a lot of discussion in the field right now to enable that, and it's something that the FDA is looking very, very closely. And it's basically, it's a very interesting time in regenerative medicine. We've developed a lot of technologies collectively, right, in the field that enable regeneration of complex tissues such as bones and other complex organs. But a lot of those are still essentially waiting for the FDA to clear what we can actually do in patients immediately. And basically, as soon as we get there, then the technology is pretty much ready to go. Whether that's going to happen in a few years or not, I guess we can't predict. But we're hoping that working together with the FDA and with other companies, the way that we are, we can push these a little bit faster, and hopefully it won't be too long before we can actually use these in humans. And we really hope that this is going to be transformative, and that we can take advantage of this technology to, I guess, make a difference. That's what we're all interested in doing here at OHSU. We're not just looking for the next breakthrough. We're really hoping that this can actually reach patients and help people's lives. And we know that especially cancers and other types of diseases can be a big burden. And we're hoping that these little improvements and little things that we do in the lab will eventually help patients that are in need. So hopefully it won't take too long.